I've told this story many times, and without exception, it has provoked the same reaction: disbelief. No matter how difficult it is for people to process, and no matter how many conventional explanations have been offered, this did happen, and it's an experience I will never forget. It started with a friend of mine, Stuart, who had always been interested in the supernatural. I, on the other hand, had no more interest in it than the next person. Of course, I'm curious about whether there is life after death, but I prefer to leave these things to themselves, as I find the entire subject morbid. I'm sure I'll learn the truth in the end, but until that day I'd rather not ask the question for fear of the answer. Stuart was captivated by the paranormal. He lived and breathed it. But our friendship had developed through another of his passions, film, and although he often asked me to go on one of his investigations, I always replied that I preferred such things to remain on the cinema screen and to stay there. We'd go for a few beers regularly at Farland's bar on the main street or catch a film at the local cinema with some mutual friends. Then, suddenly, I didn't see or hear from him for a couple of weeks, which was peculiar, but I assumed he was simply busy, and so I left it at that. It was 3:04 a.m. when he called. I was angry at first that he'd woken me, but when I heard the sound of his voice, anger quickly bled into concern. Stuart was always such an upbeat guy, but that night his voice sounded distant, and there was a new uncertainty I had never sensed before, which quivered underneath each word, unsettling me.
"I need you to come and get me,"
he said in a low whisper. "What's wrong? Where are you?" I asked.
"I can't talk for long. Just come to the old botanical gardens at the edge of town."
His breath became increasingly labored and agitated as he spoke. "Stuart, if you're in trouble, please call the police."
"No!"
he exclaimed in a unique mix of whisper and shout.
"I'm not meant to be here. They'll arrest me. Just come to the botanical gardens and send me a text when you're waiting outside. I have to go."
And with that, he hung up. 10 minutes later, I was in my car and driving to the edge of Windarm Town. It was an autumn night, and as I passed landmarks which were usually familiar to me during the day, each twisted tree branch and leaf-covered garden took on a more threatening nature than I was used to, the night revealing an unapparent side to the town I loved. It seemed strange to me that Stuart would be in the botanical gardens at night. He quite regularly went away on nocturnal investigations of abandoned hospitals and other supposedly haunted locations, but that place didn't seem like an obvious choice for such things. I pulled up in front of a large metal fence. It had been erected years previous, encircling what was left of the botanical gardens and its grounds, no doubt to dissuade new generations of rock throwers. On its gate hung a mud-smeared sign displaying the words, "No trespassing," in no uncertain terms. Stuart obviously hadn't bothered with the warning, no doubt more interested on catching a glimpse of something otherworldly inside. I left the engine running, as it was a little cold out, but just as I unlocked my phone, I received a text message.
"Kill your lights."
And so I did. Then another message quickly followed.
"Don't call me, whatever you do."
I began to develop the distinct impression that Stuart and I were not the only ones present out there in the night. A nervousness crept into my breath, and as I sat there looking into the darkness of the gardens, partially obscured by a web of fencing, I felt as though something was staring back. For a moment I was unsure how to proceed, but was then startled by another text message, and frightened by the thought that Stuart was in there somewhere and about to be grabbed by a burly security guard, a local gang, or worse. So I adhered to his instructions.
"Follow my light and get me the hell out of here."
And there it was, Stuart's torch flickering for a brief moment before being engulfed by the darkness once more. I opened the car door, the night uncomfortably cold as it washed over me. Just 30 minutes earlier I had been cozy, sleeping in my bed. And now this, climbing over a fence and walking into the darkness. The fence rattled as I pulled myself up, and as I reached the top, I looked across the pitch night and seriously reconsidered going any further. Then Stuart's torchlight flashed again, and I knew I couldn't leave him, possibly injured or trapped, with the chilled October air threatening worse. I jumped down from the fence as quietly as I could, my feet muffled by the whispering grass below. The ground was wet, and the unattended grass and bushes which surrounded the main building made progress difficult. The light flashed again, 3 times in fact before Stuart turned it off once more. I was sure now that he was growing more agitated, and so I continued in the direction of the once glass building to reach my friend as quickly as possible. But my footsteps were uncertain, and my eyes struggled to pierce the dark. I took out my phone and used the LED light on its back to see where I was going. As I walked towards the large shadowed outline of the garden building, I grew increasingly apprehensive. There were only 3 possible reasons why Stuart turned on his torch intermittently. One was that it had broken somehow. Perhaps he could only get it to flicker into life every few minutes. Another explanation would be that the battery was low. Perhaps he was lost and switched it off to conserve what little juice it had left. The last explanation was a less appealing one. I switched off my light at thought of it. Perhaps he didn't want to draw too much attention to his location. Maybe he was frightened that someone else would find him first. The darkness stood before me, a wall of black which blanketed all. It was hopeless. I was going to have to switch the light on to see where I was going. I remembered when I was 14 and had nearly fallen down an old drainage shaft when I was camping at night with friends. I always shuddered thinking about that, about how bad that fall could have been. I needed to see where I was going. If a security guard came and found me, then that was a better outcome than falling into the darkness somewhere, unseen. And yet, the thought of a night guard seemed far-fetched. The old building had been derelict for years, and it seemed unlikely that the town would waste money on wages for someone to patrol the area at night. Finally, I reached the building, its base made of red brick which had held up surprisingly well for all its years of neglect. The same could not be said of the frame. Large metal struts reached up to the sky, forming a huge domed roof. I could see pieces of the frame lying on the floor, and in the dim light from my phone I thought I saw strands of it hanging from the roof, just waiting to break off and impale any unwelcome trespassers. I cringed at the thought of my friend lying somewhere inside, perhaps impaled or trapped by falling metal and masonry. Stuart's light flickered again and then disappeared. It was indeed coming from inside. And as I ducked under and then through one of the countless empty metal frames, I realized that he was somewhere in the middle of the building. Despite having no solid walls, there was an echo of sorts to the place, subtle, my footsteps ricocheting gently off the concrete floor and then filtering out into the bleakness of the night. That was when I first noticed it, the cold. Sure, it was always cold in October, but as I slowly proceeded, shards of broken glass cracking occasionally under my weight, a chill in the air grew more pronounced. It bit at my exposed face, and I was convinced that if I looked in a mirror, my nose would have been bright red. "There! Stuart's light!" It was closer now, and for the first time I saw the light reflect upwards for a moment and illuminate Stuart's outline. As I drew nearer, the night closed in, and the cold was now becoming almost unbearable. My hands ached from the bones outward, and the air froze my insides with each breath. I was now only a few meters away from the center of that old glassless dome and my friend. Then light flickered again, but it seemed obscured somehow, as if Stuart had turned his back on me, the light from his torch bathing him in illumination for only the briefest of seconds. "Stuart, it's Mike. Are you okay?" I said softly.
"Yes, let's get the hell out of here,"
he replied nervously. Then a new noise joined us. Just as I opened my mouth to whisper across to Stuart and ask him if he was hurt, the sound of broken glass breaking under weight echoed from behind. It came from somewhere behind us and was subtle at first, but there was no doubt. I could hear movement. Yes, footsteps more pronounced. They were moving towards us. Then they stopped. All I could hear was my heart thumping, the adrenaline of apprehension coursing through my veins. Quickly, I switched off the light from my phone, hoping to obscure our location. "Someone else is here," I said.
"I know,"
whispered Stuart.
"They've been wandering around me for hours."
Then the footsteps moved again, this time circling, prowling under cover of night. I knew then why Stuart had called me. Someone was taunting him. They had been in that broken glass dome all along, terrifying my friend and me in the process. No doubt he had been terrified, but now there were 2 of us, and whoever was circling, they were surely but one. I decided we would act, pick a direction and stick to it. I moved close to my friend and whispered,
"Follow me." "Sure."
That word still haunts me. The light from Stuart's torch came on once more. But you see, it wasn't a torch. And whoever I was standing right in front of was not my friend Stuart. A strange light emanated from inside the throat of what I can only describe as the figure of a woman. The light bled out through translucent skin which seemed to take on the appearance of night, and the light forced its way up and out of her gaping mouth. At that moment, Stuart appeared from the darkness, grabbed my arm, and before I knew it, we were running. Our feet scrambled over broken glass, pummeling it further into smaller shards. I looked over my shoulder, and the horrid figure, light source and all, was chasing us. The light from her throat and mouth seemed to pulse with intermittent fury, and as we reached the metal frame of the building, she screamed words of hate and anguish, a rasping anger filled with nothing but contempt for the living. Before I knew it, we had escaped the gardens, that screeching creature seemingly constrained to the boundaries of that derelict building. We reached the fence, then the car, and then home, where I fixed both Stuart and myself a large whiskey as we tried to calm our nerves. As it turned out, Stuart had been on one of his investigations, as I'd thought. He'd heard stories of strange lights coming from the old Botanical Gardens building at night and thought he would check it out. He got more than he bargained for, that's for sure. At first, the old building seemed empty, but as the night drew in, he felt as though he was being watched. Suddenly, the batteries from his torch drained. The spare batteries he always carried with him were equally unresponsive, and so he was left in darkness, alone. It was then that he heard the footsteps and a woman's voice who simply kept saying,
"I know you're here! I know you're watching me!"
To Stuart, it sounded like she was pacing up and down, occasionally standing over him as he hid on the floor. God knows what would have happened if she'd found him. I'm sure you have realized by now that Stuart claims he never called me on his phone or sent any text messages. Indeed, he dropped it in the darkness and still hasn't found it to this day. We talk about that night occasionally, and Stuart hasn't been on an investigation since. He lost the stomach for it, and who can blame him? My unease with the memory of that night, however, doesn't revolve around the fear of meeting some spectral creature in the night. I intend to stay as far away from any haunted place as I can. It's more a fear which grabs me occasionally when I really think about what that night meant. If that horrid apparition is in any way what happens to us all when we die, that we are filled with such hatred for the living, I'd prefer to believe that there is no life after death. For what we encountered that night was a twisted reflection of all that is good in each of us. And if no good can remain, I would rather not exist at all.
I cannot describe to you how I feel right now. What I'm experiencing is so detached from the normal, I'm almost convinced I've finally gone insane. Almost. My wife B died during childbirth. She was gorgeous, funny, intelligent, stubborn. A woman whose laugh was so loud eating in restaurants was a challenge, and whose stare was so intense it made my hands shake. I lost her as she gave birth to our daughter, Sam. Of course, I could have resented Sam for taking away what was once mine in a way nothing else can be, for taking what was so truly and utterly pure. But I didn't. I knew B wouldn't have wanted any resentment. She wouldn't have wanted our only child to have a life ruined by hate. But this isn't about grief. This isn't about the physical sucker punch of losing forever something you loved. This is about something far more sinister. My daughter was lively, always running and screaming, leaping up and down the climbing frame, causing havoc in her nursery classes. So for her 6th birthday, a trip with friends to the movies had left her so pent up with energy, I could barely keep up with her as she dipped and dodged between people on the pavement. She'd occasionally turn back, through the sea of people, and shout, "Daddy, come on!" in a tone that was almost petulant. I couldn't help but love her. I tried to chase her, I really did. She was too busy looking at me when she dashed out into the road, and the bus didn't have time to stop. A sickening crunch, and the world fell silent. I cradled her broken form in my arms, too numb to weep, too hurt to move. All I could feel was the warm blood gently seep into my clothes. In the state of shock I was in, I could just think about how I was going to wash my jeans. It sounds horrid, I know, but a loss like that tears everything away from you and leaves you with only the bare thought process that make us human. The next week was a blur. I cannot place a single memory to a time in between friends and family extending their condolences and the howling sobs of mine that would break out at any moment. A door slamming, the gentle hum of the fridge, or voices laughing on the radio. I attended her funeral dressed all in black. By dressed, I don't mean merely clothes. My very essence was dark. I couldn't feel or think, and the day continued as I went through the motions, like a dying man treading water. Everyone wanted to tell me about Sam and how perfect she was, what an angel she was, as if I didn't know, as if I didn't realize what a gift my own daughter was. The man stood out from the rest as he walked up to me and handed me this large leather book. I assumed at the time he was a parent of one of Sam's friends, handing me a collection of their photos together. Or maybe I was too numb to even process his cold hands and how he never mentioned my daughter once. For a month I was lost. I drank and stayed in our now empty apartment alone, watching old box sets, too numb now to even cry. It was only when my sister arrived, when she held my hand and talked to me, that I began to come out of my shell. She'd sit and listen to the most inane things I said and gently coaxed me out of my depression. Not completely, but enough for me to begin to live what was almost a real life again. That was when I opened the book. I decided to remember Sam for all the joy she gave and was prepared to reflect on her life without feeling miserable. I opened to the first page. It was essentially a binder, full of Polaroid photos of my daughter growing up. I furrowed my brow. They were taken from a distance, blurred slightly, and I was in a few of them. I began to feel sick, but hoped that the following photos would provide some explanation. I came up with every excuse of how the man obtained these photos, desperate to view the moments of my daughter's life without a sense of trepidation. The photos grew closer and closer to my daughter's birthday. I could see the day I gave her a tiny bike after she turned 5, and the skinned knees that ensued. The book had so many more pages that I assumed the rest were empty, but there was a photo of her just before the movies on her 6th birthday. I could recognize the pink raincoat she insisted on wearing, and my hands on her shoulders. There was no photo of the crash. Instead, her life continued inside this book. Her 7th birthday had a photo of me and her in the garden, covered in paint, with a huge canvas on the floor and an extremely messy painting. Her 7th birthday. Her 7th birthday. The reality of what I was seeing hit me then, and I slammed the book shut. I sat there at the kitchen table staring at the leather. This must be some sadistic Photoshop, I hoped. Someone had taken the time to pull a horrid prank on me. I say I hoped, because essentially I couldn't believe the other explanation if there even was one. Gritting my teeth, I decided I had nothing to lose and kept reading. I can't explain the emotions I felt whilst I read accurately, listening to the sound of the page turning. I can try, but nothing could prepare you for something like this. Her life continued, showing her losing her baby teeth, her first day of senior school. My turning of the pages became more frenzied, and I began to notice something. The photographer was getting closer, closer to her. As she grew older, not in every photo, but a general trend, the photographer was getting closer and closer. More daring, perhaps. She was beautiful, stunning. As a teenager, she looked just like her mother, all curls and smiles. I grew older too, but the photos began to include me less and less. Her 16th birthday was strange. A group of her friends sitting outside drinking from little plastic cups at a picnic. But there was someone in the background. Near the bushes of the park where this was taken, a dark figure stood. You wouldn't have noticed him if not for the small shadow he cast on the grass. I leant back for a moment and exhaled. This was too weird. I'd been so caught up in watching my little girl grow up, I hadn't thought about how this would end. Moments like this are so utterly surreal that sometimes you remove yourself from them. I almost felt like I was watching myself read these, like this was a dream or a program on the television. I continued. The dark figure became more and more present in each photograph. I could almost make out features. His presence was towering, and as I turned the page, I expected to see him disappear. But instead, as the photographs grew closer to her 18th, Each birthday was marked by a caption underneath the Polaroid saying "Another year." She was no longer somewhere I recognized. Instead, the photos were of her in a dimly lit house, her face contorted by fear, striking all sorts of weird poses. Sometimes she would be dressed like an ancient queen, or she would be dressed like a maid scrubbing the floors. The figure was there even closer now. His legs or his arm would appear in each and every one. No matter how she was dressed, in every photo her face had this desperately pained expression. It killed me. There were bruises on her face. She looked thin. I couldn't do it. This was sick. Properly sick. My girl. She was looking straight at the camera, crying. She was on her knees, dressed in a black evening dress, with an apple in her mouth and her hands bound behind her back. Her makeup was ruined by her tears. It was as if she was pleading me, begging me to help. But I couldn't. I closed the book and left the room, my whole body convulsing with sobs. I couldn't call the police, of course. She was dead. The thing that keeps me up at night isn't the content of what I saw. It's that there were so many pages left.
There is a house that I spent a good portion of my childhood in, and the house that I, to this day, although no longer living in it, will always call my true home. I have many fond childhood memories in that house, and it's where our family lived the longest. What I'm about to describe are all real events experienced in this house by me and the rest of my family. These are true accounts, and are not exaggerated in any way. We've always known that house was haunted, not to the point of being insane and deadly like you see in the movies, but plenty of unnerving things have happened there. Let me start by telling you a little bit about the house. The first thing you should know is that it's very old, from the 1800s. It used to be a hotel. When my family bought it, I, being the youngest, was only a little kid. We remodeled that house, and even extended it a little. It took a very long time, but eventually, that old rickety house from the 1800s got a brand new, modern makeover. However, the things lingering in that house which we couldn't see stayed. At first it started out with smaller things. My older brother would occasionally be falling asleep in his room upstairs, which was always cold, and someone would blow in his ear. He would open his eyes and look, but of course, nobody would be there. We were told by a few different people that a cranky old woman used to live there, who would sit out rocking in her rocking chair on the balcony, which we removed, yelling at people who would walk by. There was one night during which one of my older sisters was sleeping on the couch in the living room, and she started hearing a creaking sound. She described it as wood, creaking rhythmically, coming from the spot just outside one of the upstairs windows, which used to be a door, that led out to the balcony that no longer exists. One time when I was little, being all adventurous like I was, I took a digital camera up to the furnished attic at night, where it was quiet and pitch black. I made my way into the middle of the room, held up the camera and started snapping pictures. I could only see what I was taking pictures of when the camera would flash, and then afterwards when I looked at the taken picture on the digital screen. I eventually saw in one of the pictures I had taken while I was facing a wall, a small black spot in the middle of the screen. I took another picture, pointing the same way, and saw that the spot was still there, but had grown. To me, it looked like some sort of portal to nothingness, a small void of blackness in the room, something that sucked up the light of the flash and didn't reflect any back. As I took more and more pictures of it, it got bigger and bigger, until it was almost covering the entire camera lens, just blackness. It then occurred to me that rather than growing, this black mass actually seemed to be getting closer and closer to the camera lens. I don't remember anything past that point. I must have run downstairs. Things started getting more physical. I was once in the shower when the water suddenly got cold, and I looked back to find that the knob had been turned significantly behind my back. At night, when alone, we each began to hear loud footsteps above us in the biggest room on the second floor. You would only ever hear them if you were alone, or were the only one awake. Once they were so heavy, it sounded like there was an elephant or something up there, and the ceiling creaked so loud that I half expected it to cave in on me. My sisters shared that room for a long time. Eventually one of them moved out. Only one remained in it. When she was walking around up there, you could hear her footsteps clearly. The only problem was, I would also hear those footsteps walking around when she wasn't home. Sometimes I was home alone. My mom was awakened one night when my friend was sleeping over to loud footsteps running up and down the stairs. According to her, it sounded like more than one person and was practically a stampede. She jumped out of bed, angry at us being up so late causing such a racket, opened her bedroom door into the room where you can see the bottom of the stairs, but there was only dead silence and darkness. Everything was still. She thought we must have run upstairs and she had just missed us, so she went up the stairs and opened the door to the room we were sleeping in, which was my sister's old room, now vacant after they had both moved out, but we were sound asleep. She thought maybe we were faking it and inspected us closer and realized that no, we were clearly out cold and had been that way for quite a while. She mentioned all of this to us the next day, maybe still wanting to think that it was us, but we, of course, had no idea what she was talking about. One night I was just about to fall asleep when I heard a man's voice, right in my face, whisper the word bang. It pulled me out of my sleep, making my eyes shoot open and look around the dark room to find nothing. After a minute, still being tired, I brushed it off and closed my eyes again. I started to drift back to sleep when the voice once again quietly whispered bang in my face. I opened my eyes again, to once again find nothing. This happened a total of 3 times before I was finally able to fall asleep. So many things happened in that house, but after so many years of constant activity, you get used to it, and things that used to frighten you begin to simply annoy you. Sometimes, if you were alone, and there was a persistent noise being made, where no other person was, like the squeezing and popping sound of plastic water bottles in the kitchen, you could simply look in that direction and say, "Stop it," and sometimes it would just stop. We were eventually able to get the things that were dwelling in that house out, and the activity, after years of persistence, stopped altogether. As I said earlier, I still consider that house my one and only true home, and I always will. I spent years growing up there as a child with my family and 2 of my close friends, as well as family friends. Despite the occasional paranormal activity, I have many good memories of that place. It is where my mind will always wander back to whenever I think home.
Two miles off the coast of Texas, there was an abandoned oil platform that had been turned into a shelter for homeless people. This was against the law, but the authorities didn't seem to pay much attention to us. I'm not sure how long the platform had been there before I arrived, but when I did, it was like a real city on the water. Some people traveled back and forth to the mainland on boats. Others who had been there a long time acted like a city council. There were stores, a clinic, and a gasoline-powered generator to charge cell phones. Local charities and food banks brought fresh water and dry food a few times a month. Everyone got something, but most of it was saved for those who couldn't go to the mainland to find work. The most impressive thing was the garden. Over the years, people had brought soil in buckets, so there were now dozens of planting beds on the old helicopter platform. Nobody officially took care of it, but an older lady named Marta looked after it. I lived there for 7 years. After losing all my belongings, the platform was the first place I ever felt at home. I wandered around alleys and homeless shelters for years. I had almost given up when Henry told me about the platform.
I'm heading to the coast, Tom.
Henry said one day. He was 10 years older than me and a good friend. Without him, I wouldn't have survived my first years on the streets.
I have an old friend who says there's plenty of space on an old oil platform. A guy at the coast will take me there for a few dollars. You should come along.
An oil platform? I asked, doubtful. Why on earth would you want to live on an abandoned oil platform? Sounds risky. Henry laughed and slapped my back.
It's like a floating city. No police bothering you. No store owners kicking you out of their shops. Just a group of people like us coming together to support each other. What have you got to lose?
2 days later, we got a ride to the coast. Henry and I were impressed when we arrived. When he told me about the platform, I had imagined a dirty sleeping place full of trash and waste. It was the opposite. Aside from the rust on the aging structure, the platform was impeccably clean. Nobody slept outside. Every available indoor space was used either as a sleeping area or a food storage. A friendly woman named Maria gave us sleeping bags and blankets when we arrived and led us to an old boiler room with sleeping spots for the night. She said we could leave our stuff in the boiler room, but Henry and I were skeptical.
Don't want someone stealing my stuff,
Henry said shortly.
Leaving things lying around is a good way to get robbed.
You'll find that the community here respects everyone's belongings,
She said. Maria reached into her back pocket and pulled out 2 yellow sheets of paper with handwriting on them and handed them to both of us.
These are the rules here on the platform. If you break the rules 3 times, you'll be permanently banned.
We both started reading this list of rules. Rule 1, no stealing of any kind. Not repaying debts is considered theft. Rule 2, no fighting. Rule 3, no drug use. Rule 4, drinking is allowed in moderation. Rule 5, if you don't contribute to the community, you must work to maintain the platform. Rule 6, do not enter the machinery room below the drilling module.
We have an informal council that meets every Saturday evening in the mess hall. It consists of our oldest residents. They listen to complaints and decide if a rule has been broken. If the incident is serious, the council convenes on the same day.
We thanked her and set about getting settled. Over the next few years, Henry and I fit well into the platform's community. Occasionally, new people joined, and those who had been there a long time moved on. Henry and I spent most of our time on the platform. Before he lost his job and home, Henry worked in construction and welding. The council was impressed with his skills and asked if he'd be interested in helping with facility maintenance. He agreed, but asked if I could help him. It was a good life. The unpleasant part came when we received our first banishment. During a Saturday meeting with the council, a man was brought forward to be held accountable for breaking a rule, his 3rd offense. He was an older man with a long beard and a slender build. His eyes were red from tears as he stood in front of the group.
My name is Albert Gardner,
He said with a trembling voice.
I'm accused of stealing 3 cans of soup from a neighbor. Someone found the empty cans under my bed. I've been set up. Someone knew I had been in trouble twice before and pinned this on me. Have mercy. I have nowhere else to go.
The crowd murmured as the old man cried. Henry and I could hear the different opinions in the community. Some thought there wasn't enough evidence, while others believed Albert was a known rule breaker and likely guilty.
Albert Gardner,
Said one of the council members.
this is your 3rd offense and we can't tolerate theft on the platform. Many here rely on the food donations we receive. You are banned and will not return.
No!
Albert shouted. He pulled out a rusty knife with a handle wrapped in fabric and held it toward the council.
I have nowhere to go!
As the man swung the knife in front of the group, Henry tapped me on the shoulder and motioned for me to follow him. He quietly sneaked down the corridor behind the man. Surprisingly quick for his age, he moved forward and put his arm around Albert's neck.
Take the knife from him!
Henry shouted to me, and I took the blade out of the old man's hand.
Take him to the machinery room below,
Demanded a woman from the council.
We'll hold him there until he can be taken to the shore.
Henry and I carried the struggling man out of the mess hall and down the stairs towards the machinery room. A man followed us and took a key from his pocket and unlocked the door. We threw him inside and slammed the hatch shut, and the man locked it.
You've killed me, you bastards!
Albert yelled from inside. He pounded on the door and threw his weight against the thick metal.
Can you hear me? You've killed me! They won't take me to the shore! Those damn things will kill me!
Henry and I turned to leave, but the old man's cries of fear and agony echoed in my head. What was he talking about? I would find out years later. Henry was a hard worker and well-liked in the community, but in his later years he became prone to drinking. He managed to keep it hidden for a while, but over time he became aggressive when drunk. That's when the problems began. His first offense was a simple fight. Henry sat on his bunk drinking cheap alcohol and loudly talking to anyone who would listen. A man who slept in the far corner of our area asked him to be quiet so he could sleep. Without warning, Henry punched the man in the face and told him to shut up. The second offense came when Henry, while drunk, rummaged through another man's belongings to find cigarettes. He found half a pack of crumpled Marlboros and closed the bag as the man walked in. Henry gave it back, but the damage was done. His final offense came when a woman and her husband asked Henry to fix a leak in one of the sleeping houses. He insisted that it had already been fixed, but they told him the leak was still there. Feeling offended, Henry pushed the husband away and told him to get lost. When the man asked him to come and look at the leak, Henry punched him. With that, the council decided his fate and had 2 men take him to the machinery room to wait for a departing boat. That night, as I returned to my bunk, I saw all of Henry's belongings laid out on his bed. I began packing them into a bag to take to the machinery room for his ride back to the shore. Once I'd collected them, I made my way down the stairs to the lower level of the platform. When I reached the lower level, a council member, Carl, was standing guard next to the door to the machinery room. Henry pounded on the door and begged the man to let him out. He stood motionless, staring in my direction.
"Tom, stop,"
the man said to me.
"Henry has already been sentenced. We're just waiting for a boat."
"I know," I said, showing him the bag of my friend's belongings. "Just wanted to drop off his things so he can take them with him. Don't want him to go with nothing."
"Just leave it there. I'll make sure he gets it before—"
Suddenly the air was filled with tortured screams. You could always hear muffled cries on the upper levels when someone was locked up and waiting for banishment, but the thick floor panels made them inaudible. Up close, I could hear the fear in my friend's voice.
What the hell is that?
Henry shouted.
Let me out of here! It will kill me! Open the damn door!
"You have to go,"
Carl said, pointing to the stairs. "There's something in there," I yelled. "Let him out."
"That's how it works here, Tom. If you don't want to be with him, you'd better leave."
I could see the keys to the room on a ring on his belt. I'm not sure what got into me, but I threw the bag toward Carl's head and lunged forward to grab the keys. He was momentarily shocked but quickly regained himself and started to fight back. After I landed 2 blows to the side of his head, he slumped to the floor. I took the keys from his belt and opened the door. As the door squeaked open, I started yelling for Henry, but the words caught in my throat. Above my friend stood a gaunt creature covered in damp, scaly skin. Gill openings opened and closed on its neck, and violet eyes stared at me from its bulbous head. As I made eye contact with it, the creature opened its huge jaws and hissed before grabbing Henry's lifeless body by the head. It turned toward an opening next to the drilling shaft and began dragging Henry in that direction. A purplish trail followed behind them. Henry's eyes were barely open as he raised his hand in my direction, seeking help. The creature's hand twisted, and a dry cracking echoed through the machinery room before it tossed Henry's lifeless body through the hole. A crooked hand reached out in my direction, mimicking the same gesture Henry had made. The creature opened its mouth again and let out a hellish laugh. After finishing its mockery, it stepped back and fell through the hole into the rolling waves below. That same night, I left the platform and drove as far away from the coast as I could. After a few days in a homeless shelter in Houston, I left the state. Now I live in Omaha. There's plenty of work on the farms, and I managed to get a small apartment. The green pastures make me feel safe, but when I try to sleep at night, the sound of the ocean still echoes in my head. I haven't told anyone what I saw. The authorities wouldn't believe me anyway.
It started when we called out to the stars, into the darkness. We felt so small, tumbling through vast emptiness while clinging to the skin of the world, and without a single reason why. We were curious, yes, but ultimately I think we were just terribly frightened. And we were young, so very young. We were children, and like a lonely lost child, we did the only thing we could think of to make it stop. We did what we thought we had to do to make the universe make sense. We called for help. For years we scanned the sky for a sign. We sent signals to the stars and the darkness beyond. Are we alone? But the skies were quiet, always so quiet, leaving us to our own makings. But crying children never cease, and neither did we. We sent calls into every corner of space for decade after decade. We refused to believe no one was out there. They had to be. Yet for some unknown reason, they never answered us. Everyone remembers when that changed. They think it responded to the Arecibo message from 1974. The response to the Arecibo message was received almost 3 months ago in 2 separate parts. The first part of the message was received at the Hat Creek Radio Observatory in California. The Allen Telescope Array picked up what sounded like static interference that continued on for over an hour. It consisted of unintelligible screeching and buzzing sounds that continued without pause for the whole hour. The meaning of this message was never discovered, if it had one. The only thing we knew was that the signal's origin came somewhere in the Hercules constellation, near Messier 13. As soon as that signal stopped, the real message began. We made contact that day and we were asked a question.
Who is there?
It came not through the radios, but as a voice. A voice inside all of our heads asked the question to all of us. I heard it. My wife heard it. The young heard it, and the old heard it. Even the deaf heard it. Everyone, everywhere, heard this voice whisper that question in their heads in every language on earth. I remember it almost too clearly. It asked in that familiar yet indescribable voice that's always there in my mind. It was like one of my own thoughts had gone rogue and had decided to speak directly to me. The world seemed to stop as everyone listened for what came next.
Where are you?
The heavy question seemed to linger in our minds for hours afterwards, and then for days, and then for weeks. That day changed everything. There were the doubters from the very beginning, and the holy ones, who claimed that God had spoken to all of us, and that the time to repent was now. There were those who claimed they'd heard nothing, and those who'd claimed that the aliens had given them their own secret messages. And of course, there were those who truly believed that we had been contacted for the first time by an extraterrestrial race like us, one ready to communicate, ready to lead us out of the dark. We were wrong. We never made contact with alien life, at least nothing comprehensible or discernible to human understanding. The stars are vast, and in their vastness, our voices had touched the ears of something truly incomprehensible, something hungry and malevolent. The voice. We realized our mistake when the ground started to groan. Beneath our feet, everywhere, the ground seemed to moan. The muffled sounds shook through the dust and dirt below us. No one knew what was causing it, at least, not until the calls started coming in. The graveyards were screaming. All at once, the dead had started screaming. Every deceased man, woman, and child was turning in their graves. All the animals did so too. Every dog, every cat, everything that had ever walked this earth. The cries of ancient whales shook the seas, and the shrill screeching of birds echoed in the forests. The caskets shook, and the morgues howled. The voices stopped together in an instant, leaving the world in an amplified silence. In their absence, a new sound filled the air. The voice returned.
I hear you.
It came as a whisper from behind, an ominous yet oddly playful presence that felt so close but was truly still so far away. It let us breathe in the silence for a minute before it made us a promise. It was a promise we all knew to be true.
I am coming.
The voice was gone, and the air was again filled with screams. This time they were from the living. After the voice had gone, we were left to our own devices. Millions panicked, and rightfully so, as chaos took hold of the streets. Many would die in the violence and the gunfire of that night. They would be known as the raptured before long, and the rest of us were the condemned. We could only wait. The screaming dead was only the first of the side effects that we felt as the voice approached. The closer it got, the more we felt it. That first night after the screaming, we noticed the stars bleed for the first time. A section of the western sky had turned black, blacker than the night. It was only truly visible because of the ring of stars around it. The light from those stars had turned red, and they seemed to bleed across the sky like food coloring dropped into water. Their light swirled and flowed all around the edge of some unseen mass. I knew then that I was staring into the face of the voice. Our scientists claimed that nothing was there, and that their radar and scans always came up empty. Their telescopes could see nothing but darkness in that section of space. However, the proof was right in front of us as every night that ring of darkness got wider and more stars bled in the sky. We watched it come. As each night passed, the black spot would widen, and more stars would distort and bleed around it. During the day, a new hell would greet us. The side effects worsened. The day always brought something new. I'm sure most of what happened will go untold and unknown. The animals started disappearing, all of them. No tracks, traces, or bodies were left behind. Pets would run away, some violently so. They all retreated, never to be seen again. The forests were left abandoned, the oceans empty, the air was left silent. The world left seemed empty and lonely. They left like water receding from the shore, just before the tsunami breaks. One day about 2 weeks ago, scientists tried to talk to the voice again. They hoped perhaps to reason with it. They told it about what was happening on our world and asked it questions. The scientists begged. It didn't speak. When asked what the voice sent a response. The next night the skies lit up with streaks of fire. It was alight for hours, blazoned with orange and red. We didn't realize the effects until the next day when the televisions turned to static and the telephones refused to work. We watched as all the satellites were knocked out of the heavens. After that, reports became rumors and rumblings, sanity a thing of the past. The air chilled and weighed us down. The voice was nearly here, and everyone felt it. It rained for a week after the satellites fell. The rain was salty and mired with an unknown filth that turned the grass black. Maybe the satellites tracked something back in with them when they hit the sky. No one knew for sure. All we know is that it fell from clouds black as charcoal that blotted out the sun, like liquid ash. When the clouds went away, the skies were empty. There were no clouds, yet the sky hung low and gray. If the sun was anywhere in the sky, it never made itself known. Even it had abandoned us. Each day grew slowly darker and darker until night and day became almost the same. Some people would claim later that they'd seen things in the dark, creatures with gangly limbs and crooked faces, lurking in the corner of their vision. They were tall, white creatures that looked molted or rotten through their transparent skin. Appearances would last for just a second or two before vanishing without a trace. Some believed this was the first step in the aliens' invasion, but the rest of us didn't know what to think. We just knew that it was nothing that simple or benign. They must have been hallucinations, just more madness to endure, but ultimately as harmless as anything else. As harmless as the screams of the dead, the missing animals, and the dying sky. Appearances slowly increased in duration and number. I think everyone saw them once at the least, but I don't think a single person would ever guess why they were truly here. They never touched nor spoke to anyone, and they certainly never harmed anyone. Most who got good looks at them described them as mournful or sorrowful looking. Some even claimed the creatures watched over them at night, and others even claimed that it seemed as if the creatures were sorry for them. One claimed to have even seen one prostrate upon the ground, hands clasped above its head. He said it was praying for us. Prayer was no help. The churches and places of worship that had divided us for so long failed to bring hope to any in the end. The voice let them pray and beg for a while, but just days ago the voice ended it all. No one questioned how, for at this point nothing that happened surprised anyone anymore. But on the final day, all books of worship burned. Every last Bible, every Quran, everything. People rushed to their centers of faith but found no solace. The churches and temples had suffered the same fates, if not worse. The people were left, abandoned by their greatest hopes. There were rumors of churches all over the world, with walls formed from the bodies of those who sought refuge. They were merged to the walls, stuck to them like flies in a trap. They died still pleading for hope, but they were beyond God's help. The rest of us had learned to stop begging. We waited. The final message came. From beyond the sky it fell upon us. The voice echoed and it spoke the simple truth.
I am here.
There is a darkness beyond the horizon, the likes of which I doubt has ever been seen. It brings with it the screams of countless souls, and it moves fast. The stars are dying now, and I know they'll never be seen again. I leave this not as a warning. No, it's far too late for that. Instead, consider this the last realization, the last humanity will ever know. For we used to wonder whether or not we were alone and lost, but never whether or not we were safe and hidden. The universe is infinite, and our understanding was significantly more finite. We should never have beckoned to the darkness. Instead, we should have clung to the light and closed our eyes every time we were turned to the void. As the final minutes approach, I hold one final truth to be certain. I now know why the skies were always so quiet.